Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The whiskey glass shattered against the wall behind Pierre Boudreau's gray head, sending amber liquid and sharp fragments cascading down his weathered face as three men circled him like vultures around dying prey. The old cowboy sat hunched at his corner table in the Devil's Den saloon, his arthritic hands trembling as the Moreau brothers, Jacques, Henri, and Claude, prepared to make sport of a man whose only crime was existing in their territory while being too old and weak to fight back against younger predators who found entertainment in breaking spirits that had already been bent by loss and time. "Look at this pathetic old fool," Jacques sneered, grabbing Pierre's worn hat and tossing it into the spittoon where tobacco juice stained the brim that had protected the old man's face through 40 years of honest work under the brutal Colorado sun. "Thinks he can drink with real men when he should be in a grave with all the other useless relics who've outlived their purpose in this territory." The cruel laughter that followed echoed through the saloon like the sound of demons celebrating another soul's descent into hell. Pierre's silence only encouraged their cruelty, because the Moreau brothers had learned that dignity could be more entertaining to destroy than defiance. And this old cowboy's refusal to beg or cry made him a perfect target for men whose own failures in life had taught them to find worth in making others suffer. At 73, Pierre had survived more hardships than most men could imagine, but age had made him vulnerable to predators who measured their strength by how much pain they could inflict on those too weak to resist. "Please," Pierre whispered, his voice barely audible above the brothers' taunts. "I just wanted one drink to remember my Martha on the anniversary of her passing. I'm not looking for trouble with you boys." His Louisiana accent made the Moreau brothers laugh harder, because they'd learned that different was dangerous in a frontier town where conformity meant survival and standing out meant becoming prey for men who viewed compassion as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. But in the darkest corner of the Devil's Den, a figure in black had been watching the confrontation with eyes that missed nothing and a stillness that suggested death itself, waiting for the proper moment to reveal its presence. Etienne Lafitte sat motionless behind a whiskey glass that hadn't been touched in 2 hours, his face hidden beneath a hat brim that cast shadows deep enough to conceal features that had become legendary throughout 3 territories. When the temperature in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the blazing fire in the hearth, everyone present suddenly realized they were about to witness either a massacre or a miracle. Etienne Lafitte's name was whispered across the American frontier with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, and other forces of nature that could reshape landscapes and end lives before anyone realized they were in danger. For 20 years, he'd walked the line between civilization and chaos, serving justice to men who thought themselves above law or consequence, while building a reputation that made experienced killers cross streets to avoid accidental confrontation with someone whose skills had transcended human limitations. The stories told about Etienne varied depending on the teller's proximity to actual events, but certain facts had been confirmed by too many witnesses to dismiss as frontier exaggeration. He'd killed 78 men in fair fights, each death justified by circumstances that left no doubt about which participant deserved to continue breathing. More importantly, he'd never drawn his weapon against anyone who didn't deserve killing, which made him something rarer than a fast gun. He was death with a conscience that governed when and why he used his terrible gifts. What made Etienne truly fearsome wasn't just his ability to kill, but his intelligence in choosing when death was necessary and when other forms of justice might serve better purposes. He'd been a Confederate cavalry officer, a federal marshal, a Pinkerton detective, and a territorial judge, adapting his methods to serve principles that remained constant even as his official positions changed with political winds that swept across regions where law was whatever the strongest man decided it should be. The silence that followed his arrival in any frontier town was the kind that preceded either violent storms or divine intervention, because everyone understood that legends didn't appear randomly. They manifested when circumstances required the kind of decisive action that ordinary men couldn't provide. His presence in the Devil's Den tonight wasn't coincidence but destiny, revealing itself through events that would transform cruel entertainment into something far more dangerous for men who'd forgotten that age and weakness didn't make someone fair game for predators. As Pierre Boudreau suffered humiliation that no decent man should endure in his twilight years, Etienne's attention focused on details that would determine whether this confrontation ended in education or elimination. The old cowboy's dignity despite degradation, the brother's casual cruelty that revealed souls corrupted beyond redemption, and the terrible mathematics of justice that sometimes required violence to protect innocence from evil that recognized no limits except superior force applied without mercy or hesitation. Pierre Boudreau hadn't always been the broken-down target that the Moreau brothers found so amusing to torment. 40 years ago, he'd been one of the most respected ranch foremen in Louisiana Territory. A man whose word was his bond and whose skill with horses and cattle had earned him prosperity that seemed secure until war and Reconstruction had swept away everything he'd spent his life building, through honest work and fair dealing with neighbors who'd learned to trust his judgment in matters of livestock and land management. The losses that had transformed Pierre from respected community leader to solitary drifter began with the Civil War, when both his sons had ridden away to fight for causes they believed in but would never return to defend, their graves marked by wooden crosses in distant battlefields where strangers' tears fell on soil that would never know their names or honor their sacrifice. His wife Martha had survived the war, but not the grief of losing both children to violence that had solved nothing while destroying everything that made their struggles worthwhile. The years following the war had brought additional devastation as carpetbaggers and corrupt officials had seized property through legal manipulation that honest farmers couldn't afford to challenge in courts where justice served whoever could pay the highest bribes to judges who'd forgotten their oaths in favor of personal enrichment through systematic exploitation of families whose only crime had been believing in democratic principles that were supposed to protect rather than destroy their hopes for decent lives. By the time Pierre had lost his ranch to tax schemes designed to transfer land from Confederate veterans to Northern speculators, he'd become a wanderer whose only possessions were memories of better days and the dignity that couldn't be stolen by circumstances beyond his control. His migration to Colorado Territory represented one last attempt to find peace in regions where his past might not follow him, but frontier life had proven as cruel as Reconstruction politics in punishing men whose only weapons were honor and decency. The drink he'd been nursing at the Devil's Den was purchased with coins saved from odd jobs that barely provided subsistence, meant to serve as toast to Martha's memory on the anniversary of her death from heartbreak that no medicine could cure because it was caused by losses that couldn't be replaced through any amount of hope or determination. Instead of peaceful remembrance, his simple desire for solitary mourning had attracted predators who viewed grief as entertainment and vulnerability as invitation to demonstrate their power over someone who couldn't fight back against numbers and youth that overwhelmed wisdom and experience. The Moreau brothers had built their reputation through systematic brutality that made honest citizens avoid the Devil's Den after dark, when their drinking transformed casual meanness into deliberate cruelty that sought victims among anyone unfortunate enough to be present, when their alcohol-fueled sadism required targets for violence that served no purpose except their twisted entertainment. Jacques, the eldest at 35, was the strategist whose intelligence had been corrupted by discovering that fear was more immediately profitable than fairness, and that reputation for ruthlessness opened doors that honest work couldn't. Henri, the middle brother at 32, served as their primary enforcer through physical intimidation that had crippled men for lesser offenses than looking at him wrong during his frequent rages that erupted without warning or apparent cause. His massive frame and scarred knuckles testified to countless fights where mercy had been abandoned in favor of decisive brutality that ended disputes permanently while establishing precedents that discouraged future challenges to Moreau authority throughout territories where their word had become law. Claude, the youngest at 28, was perhaps the most dangerous because his boyish appearance concealed complete absence of conscience that allowed him to commit atrocities that even hardened criminals found disturbing. He specialized in psychological torture that broke spirits before breaking bones, using apparent innocence to lure victims into situations where physical escape was impossible and emotional destruction became inevitable through methods that left no visible marks but created wounds that never healed. Together, they'd terrorized Perdition Creek for 3 years through protection rackets that forced businesses to pay tribute, claim jumping that drove legitimate miners from valuable deposits, and random violence that kept the population too frightened to organize resistance against criminals who'd learned that local law enforcement could be purchased more easily than challenged through legal proceedings that required courage most citizens couldn't afford when survival depended on avoiding attention from predators who ruled through fear. Their treatment of Pierre represented typical Moreau entertainment, identifying the weakest target available, isolating them from potential help, then taking pleasure in their suffering while demonstrating to witnesses what happened to anyone who might consider standing up to established power that recognized no authority except superior violence applied without restraint or moral consideration. The old cowboy's dignity in the face of degradation only made their cruelty more satisfying, because breaking noble spirits provided entertainment that ordinary brutality couldn't match. Etienne's movement from his corner table was so fluid and controlled that it seemed choreographed by death itself. His approach transforming the Devil's Den's atmosphere from crude entertainment to something far more dangerous, as every instinct for survival that frontier life had developed in the saloon's patrons screamed warnings about the legendary killer who was finally revealing his presence after hours of silent observation. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made smart men listen and stupid ones make their final mistakes. "Gentlemen," Etienne said, his words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water, "I believe you owe this man an apology for your behavior, which has been discourteous to someone whose age and dignity deserve respect rather than mockery from men young enough to be his grandsons." The suggestion was delivered without heat or emphasis, which somehow made it more terrifying than any amount of shouting could have achieved, because true power didn't need volume to command attention from anyone intelligent enough to recognize authority when they encountered it. Jacques Moreau's response revealed both his arrogance and his fatal misunderstanding of the situation he'd created through years of terrorizing people who couldn't fight back against superior numbers and local influence. "This ain't your concern, stranger," he said, positioning himself between Etienne and the door, while his brothers flanked the legendary gunfighter in formation they'd used successfully against previous challengers who'd lacked the skills to survive coordinated assault by experienced killers who understood pack tactics. "You're mistaken," Etienne replied, his hand settling casually near his gun in a position that suggested readiness without threatening immediate violence, because he understood that some men required education before elimination, and that wisdom sometimes meant offering chances for redemption that weren't always accepted by criminals whose pride exceeded their intelligence. Cruelty to defenseless elders is everyone's concern in civilized society, and while this may not be the most civilized place, it's still society, which means it has rules that apply to everyone. The challenge was delivered with absolute certainty that left no room for misinterpretation about what would happen if the Moreau brothers chose continued confrontation over immediate departure from premises where their presence was no longer welcome. As tension stretched through the devil's den like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, every witness understood they were about to see either justice served or legend destroyed, because some moments in frontier history couldn't be avoided through negotiation or compromise. They had to be resolved through superior skill applied with deadly precision against enemies who'd forgotten that some lines couldn't be crossed without facing consequences that reputation and numbers couldn't prevent. Henri Moreau's decision to test the stranger's resolve came from years of successful intimidation that had taught him wrong lessons about the difference between terrorizing honest citizens and challenging legendary gunfighters whose reputations were built on surviving exactly these kinds of confrontations. His massive hand dropped toward his weapon with confidence born from encounters where superior size and local influence had been sufficient to discourage resistance, but what he found instead was speed that seemed to violate natural law as Etienne's Colt appeared in his hand and fired before Henri's fingers reached leather. The bullet took Henri in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his unfired weapon clattering across the saloon floor while he roared in pain and shock at discovering that his reputation for invincibility had just been shattered by someone whose skills exceeded anything he'd previously encountered in 3 years of terrorizing people who couldn't defend themselves against coordinated brutality. The thunder of gunfire transformed the Devil's Den from place of entertainment into battlefield, where survival depended on making correct decisions in fractions of seconds that determined life and death. "That was your warning shot," Etienne announced calmly, his gun already back in its holster, despite the fact that 2 armed enemies remained capable of continuing hostilities if their intelligence proved insufficient to overcome pride that had been damaged by witnessing their brother's humiliation. "The next shots will be placed with permanent intent if you choose to escalate this confrontation beyond education into elimination. I suggest you collect your wounded brother and leave before I decide that mercy is wasted on men who torture defenseless elders for entertainment." Jacques and Claude's assessment of their tactical situation revealed odds that had shifted dramatically against them, because they were now facing someone who'd just demonstrated capabilities that transformed what should have been easy intimidation into potential massacre if they chose violence over withdrawal. Their brother's wound provided visible proof that reputation and reality sometimes aligned in ways that made continued resistance suicidal rather than heroic, and intelligence finally overcame arrogance in calculations that determined survival. "This ain't over, stranger," Jacques said as he helped Henri to his feet. The threat delivered with less conviction than his words suggested because everyone present understood that it was indeed over. The Moreau brothers' reign of terror had just encountered force that couldn't be intimidated, purchased, or overwhelmed through tactics that had worked against ordinary citizens who lacked the skills to defend themselves against organized cruelty. As they retreated from the Devil's Den with their wounded pride and bleeding brother, Pierre Boudreau looked up at his defender with eyes that showed the first hope he'd felt since Martha's death. The silence that followed the Moreau brothers' departure was broken by Pierre's trembling voice as he struggled to express gratitude that words couldn't adequately convey to someone who'd risked everything to defend a stranger's dignity against predators who'd seemed untouchable through conventional resistance. "Thank you, sir," the old cowboy said, his Louisiana accent thick with emotion that came from unexpected discovery that decency still existed in a world that had taught him to expect cruelty from anyone strong enough to inflict it without facing consequences. Etienne's response revealed character that had made him legendary not just for killing ability, but for moral principles that governed when and why he used deadly skills in service of justice rather than personal gain. "No thanks necessary, Mr. Boudreau," he said, somehow knowing the old man's name despite their lack of previous introduction, his voice carrying warmth that few people had ever heard from someone whose reputation was built on bringing death to those who deserved it. Protecting elders from bullies isn't heroism. It's basic human decency that every civilized man should provide without expectation of reward or recognition. The use of his name startled Pierre because he'd been careful to avoid attracting attention during his months in Perdition Creek. Living quietly on the edges of society while hoping to remain invisible to predators who might view his vulnerability as invitation for the kind of cruelty he'd just experienced. "How do you know my name?" he asked, studying Etienne's face for recognition that might explain their connection, despite his certainty that he'd never met anyone matching the legendary gunfighter's description during his wandering years. "I knew your sons," Etienne replied, his words hitting Pierre like lightning, because no one in Colorado territory should have known about Jean-Baptiste and Auguste Boudreau, who died at Gettysburg and Antietam respectively, their graves marked by wooden crosses in distant battlefields where their sacrifice had been forgotten by everyone except the father who'd mourned them every day since receiving news of their deaths. Good men who died for principles they believed were worth defending, even when defending them meant leaving family behind to grieve losses that couldn't be replaced through any amount of hope or determination. The revelation that this legendary gunfighter had personal knowledge of his dead sons created connection that transcended their chance encounter in a frontier saloon, because shared memory of fallen heroes transformed strangers into something approaching family among men who'd learned to measure relationships by blood spilled rather than blood shared. As Pierre struggled to process information that changed everything about his understanding of why fate had brought them together on this anniversary of Martha's death, Etienne was already planning how to ensure that the old cowboy's remaining years would be marked by dignity rather than degradation at the hands of predators who viewed age as weakness to be exploited rather than wisdom to be respected. Etienne's knowledge of Pierre's sons came from shared service during the war years when he'd served as Confederate cavalry officer responsible for coordinating with Louisiana infantry units that included the Boudreau boys, whose courage and character had made them respected among men who'd learned to judge worth through actions rather than words, during campaigns where survival depended on trusting comrades whose dedication to shared cause exceeded their concern for personal safety. "Jean-Baptiste saved my life at Shiloh," Etienne explained, his voice carrying weight of memories that had been carefully preserved through 20 years of honoring debts that could never be fully repaid to men who died believing their sacrifice would create better world for families they'd left behind. "Auguste died covering our retreat at Antietam," Etienne continued, his words revealing details that only someone present during those terrible days could have known about young men whose heroism had been witnessed by few and recorded by none, except comrades whose own survival had depended on their willingness to die for principles that seemed more important than life itself. "He could have run with the rest of us, but he stayed to hold the line so that wounded men could be evacuated to safety. Your boys were the kind of soldiers who made defeat honorable and victory meaningful when we managed to achieve it." Pierre's tears came freely as he heard confirmation that his sons' deaths had meaning beyond political abstractions, because knowing that they died protecting comrades rather than just advancing military objectives gave their sacrifice personal dimension that made grief more bearable even as it made loss more profound. "They were good boys," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion that he'd kept buried for 2 decades of wandering through territories where mentioning Confederate service could be dangerous for men whose loyalty to fallen causes marked them as potential threats to Reconstruction authorities. "They were good men," Etienne corrected gently, his words acknowledging that war had transformed boys into warriors whose courage had been tested under circumstances that revealed character rather than just training, because battlefield survival required moral strength that couldn't be taught through military drill or tactical instruction. And they spoke of their father with respect that made it clear they'd been raised by someone who taught them that honor was more important than safety and that protecting others was worth any personal cost. The connection established through shared memories of fallen heroes created bonds that frontier isolation had made Pierre believe were impossible to recreate. Because finding someone who'd known his sons as men, rather than just memories, gave weight to experiences that had begun to feel like dreams, rather than actual events that had shaped his understanding of what made life worth living, despite losses that couldn't be recovered through any amount of hope or determination. As Etienne settled into the chair across from him, Pierre realized that this chance encounter might represent providence rather than coincidence, because some meetings were too perfectly timed to be explained through random chance. Etienne's study of Pierre's current circumstances revealed living conditions that were unworthy of any man, much less someone whose sons had died defending principles that their father had instilled through years of demonstrating that character mattered more than comfort and that dignity couldn't be stolen by external circumstances, no matter how difficult they became. The old cowboy's worn clothes, careful management of single drink purchased with hoarded coins, and obvious malnutrition painted picture of poverty that was both temporary and unnecessary for someone with family connections, to men who understood obligation and honor. "You're coming with me," Etienne announced, his words delivered with authority that brooked no argument from someone whose pride might object to charity, but whose circumstances required intervention from people with resources and willingness to honor debts that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. "I've got a ranch outside town where you'll have your own room, decent meals, and work that matches your capabilities rather than your current desperation. It's not charity, it's paying debt I owe to Jean-Baptiste and Auguste for keeping me alive when staying alive seemed less important than dying honorably." Pierre's initial resistance came from independence that had sustained him through 40 years of honest work, followed by 20 years of loss that had taught him to depend on no one except himself, because accepting help required admitting weakness that his generation viewed as character failure rather than temporary circumstance that could be improved through assistance from people who understood that strength sometimes meant allowing others to provide support when individual efforts proved insufficient for survival with dignity. "I don't need charity," Pierre said, his voice carrying pride that had been damaged but not destroyed by months of scraping existence on society's margins, where employment opportunities were limited to tasks that younger men could perform more efficiently, leaving older workers to compete for jobs that barely provided subsistence while preserving illusion of independence that meant more than comfort to men whose identity was built on self-reliance and useful contribution to community welfare. "This isn't charity," Etienne replied firmly, his words cutting through objections that came from wounded pride rather than rational assessment of available options for man whose age and isolation made survival increasingly difficult, without support from people who understood that helping others was form of strength rather than weakness. "This is family obligation to someone whose children died protecting mine during war that took good men and left survivors to honor their memory through actions that would make them proud. Jean-Baptiste and Auguste would expect me to ensure their father's remaining years are marked by dignity rather than degradation at hands of predators who mistake age for weakness." The ride to Etienne's ranch revealed landscape that had been transformed from wilderness into productive operation through years of careful planning and hard work that demonstrated how legendary reputation could be balanced with practical commitment to building something meaningful beyond personal glory or professional achievement. The spread encompassed thousands of acres where cattle grazed on grassland that had been improved through scientific management, and horses ran free on pastures that provided everything necessary for breeding stock that was sought throughout the territory for quality and temperament. Pierre's amazement at the ranch's prosperity was tempered by recognition that this level of success required more than just gun skills and frontier reputation, because sustainable operation demanded business acumen, agricultural knowledge, and management capabilities that went far beyond anything necessary for survival. As wandering gunfighter whose only assets were deadly accuracy and moral principles that governed when killing, was justified by circumstances beyond legal resolution. "How does a gunfighter build something like this?" Pierre asked as they approached the main house, which was substantial enough to accommodate family while remaining practical for working ranch where comfort was balanced with functionality in ways that suggested long-term planning rather than temporary accommodation for someone whose lifestyle might require immediate departure when legal or personal complications made staying dangerous for anyone associated with legendary killer. "Same way anyone builds anything worthwhile," Etienne replied, his answer revealing perspective that had been shaped by understanding that reputation was less important than results, and that true success was measured by positive impact on community rather than personal fame or fortune acquired through activities that served individual interests rather than broader social good. "You work hard, treat people fairly, and invest in things that matter more than immediate gratification or temporary advantage over neighbors who deserve cooperation rather than competition." The ranch hands who greeted their arrival showed respect that came from experience working for someone whose leadership was based on competence and fairness rather than intimidation or exploitation of workers who deserved decent treatment in exchange for honest labor that contributed to shared success. Their obvious affection for Etienne revealed character that had been developed through years of balancing legendary gunfighting skills with practical commitment to building community where people could prosper through cooperation rather than survive through conflict that benefited no one except those who profited from others' misfortune. The Moreau brothers' rage at their humiliation in the Devil's Den festered for 3 days before erupting into plans for revenge that would restore their reputation through elimination of the stranger who dared to interfere with their entertainment and wound Henri in front of witnesses whose respect was essential for maintaining criminal authority that depended on fear rather than genuine leadership. Jacques' strategy involved gathering reinforcements from criminal associates throughout the territory, men whose skills and lack of conscience made them suitable for eliminating targets that required more than simple intimidation. "We can't let this stand," Jacques declared to his brothers as they planned retaliation that would send clear message to anyone who might consider challenging Moreau authority in future confrontations, where local reputation should have been sufficient to discourage interference from outsiders whose presence threatened established power relationships. "If word spreads that some stranger can walk into our town and humiliate us without facing consequences, every two-bit gunfighter in the territory will think they can make their reputation by challenging us." Henri's wounded shoulder provided constant reminder of their humiliation, while limiting his effectiveness in physical confrontations that had previously relied on his intimidating presence and devastating fists to discourage resistance from victims who understood that fighting back would only increase their suffering. His reduced capability made recruitment of additional gunmen necessary for operation that would require superior numbers to overcome opponent whose speed and accuracy had been demonstrated in ways that left no doubt about his capabilities. Claude's contribution to their planning involved psychological warfare designed to force their enemy into disadvantageous position, where his legendary skills would be neutralized by circumstances that made accurate shooting impossible without risking innocent lives that any decent man would refuse to endanger. "We grabbed the old man," Claude suggested, his boyish features concealing mind that viewed human beings as tools to be used and discarded according to strategic requirements rather than moral considerations. "Use him as bait to draw our stranger into situation where his conscience becomes liability rather than strength." The plan that emerged from their collaboration involved kidnapping Pierre during his daily routine, using him as hostage to force Etienne into confrontation where superior numbers and strategic positioning would overcome individual skill through coordinated assault that would eliminate legendary gunfighter while demonstrating consequences of interfering with Moreau family business. What they failed to understand was that threatening family, whether blood relation or chosen obligation, would transform educational encounter into total war, where mercy would be abandoned in favor of decisive action that left no room for future challenges to authority that served justice rather than criminal profit. Pierre's capture occurred during his morning ride to check boundary fences, a routine that had become precious to him during weeks of rediscovering purpose through useful work that contributed to ranch operations while providing exercise that kept his aging body functional despite years of neglect and malnutrition that had weakened constitution without breaking spirit that remained strong despite losses that would have destroyed weaker men. The ambush was professionally executed by men whose experience in violent crime made them effective at capturing targets who weren't expecting attack from organized criminals willing to kidnap elderly ranchers. The message delivered to Etienne was brutally direct. Written on paper stained with blood that might have come from Pierre's injuries or from threats designed to emphasize seriousness of situation that demanded immediate response from someone whose legendary skills were now required to save family member whose only crime had been accepting protection from gunfighter, whose reputation attracted enemies like honey attracted flies. "Your old friend is with us," the note read. "Come alone to Devil's Canyon at sunset, or find his body scattered across rocks where vultures can clean bones that won't be buried in proper grave." Etienne's response to the kidnapping was swift and comprehensive. His transformation from peaceful rancher to legendary killer occurring with speed that revealed how quickly civilized behavior could be abandoned when family safety required violence that served justice rather than personal satisfaction. His preparation for rescue operation included weapons selection that balanced accuracy with ammunition capacity, tactical planning that accounted for multiple enemies in defensive positions, and psychological preparation for killing that would be necessary to protect innocent man whose only crime had been trusting someone whose reputation attracted danger. The ride to Devil's Canyon provided time for reflection on costs of legendary status that made normal relationships dangerous for anyone associated with men whose skills and moral principles attracted challenges from criminals who viewed reputation as commodity to be acquired through elimination of previous holders. Pierre's kidnapping represented typical pattern of enemies who understood that legends could be destroyed through exploitation of their virtues rather than direct confrontation with their capabilities, because protecting others created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by men with no moral limitations. As sunset approached and shadows lengthened across landscape that would soon witness confrontation between justice and criminal enterprise, Etienne understood that this battle would determine whether his remaining years would be spent protecting family or mourning losses that could have been prevented through earlier action against enemies who viewed mercy as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. The mathematics of survival were simple. Save Pierre or spend rest of his life regretting failure to protect someone whose sons had died protecting others during war that had taught bitter lessons about cost of honor in world where evil men preyed on good ones. Devil's Canyon provided perfect natural amphitheater for ambush, its high walls offering concealment for marksmen while limiting escape routes for anyone foolish enough to enter killing ground where superior numbers and strategic positioning should have overwhelmed individual skill regardless of reputation or legendary status. The Moreau brothers had chosen their battlefield carefully, recruiting 12 additional gunmen whose placement on canyon rim would create crossfire that should have made accurate return fire impossible, while ensuring that any attempt at rescue would result in death for both victim and would-be savior. Etienne's approach to the canyon revealed tactical awareness that had been developed through 20 years of surviving situations where enemies held every apparent advantage except superior skill and commitment to principles that made retreat impossible when innocent lives depended on successful resolution of conflicts that couldn't be avoided through negotiation or compromise. His study of terrain, gun positions, and possible escape routes was conducted with professional detachment that balanced emotional investment in Pierre's safety with practical requirements for successful operation against superior numbers. "Right on time!" Jacques called from his position behind rocks that provided cover while allowing clear view of canyon floor, where their enemy was expected to provide entertaining target practice for men who'd never faced opponent whose reputation was built on surviving exactly these kinds of impossible odds. "Your old friend is alive and mostly unharmed, though that could change quickly if you don't follow instructions exactly as we give them. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully, and maybe we'll make his death quick instead of entertaining." Pierre's condition was visible from Etienne's position. The old cowboy bound to wooden post that had been positioned to provide clear shot for rescuer while ensuring that any missed bullets would kill hostage, rather than captors who understood psychology of decent men whose consciences could be used against them in situations where moral principles became tactical disadvantages. Blood on Pierre's face suggested rough handling during capture, but his upright posture indicated spirit that hadn't been broken by men whose cruelty was limited by their need to keep him alive long enough to serve their purposes. "I see 14 men," Etienne called back, his voice carrying across canyon with clarity that suggested calm assessment of tactical situation rather than fear or desperation that his enemies had expected from someone facing impossible odds against coordinated opposition. "Is that all you could manage? I was expecting more professional challenge from men whose reputation for brutality suggested greater competence in planning operations that require more than simple intimidation of defenseless victims." The insult was calculated to provoke emotional response that would compromise tactical discipline among enemies whose pride exceeded their intelligence. Etienne's assault on the canyon positions began with impossible shot that took Jacques Moreau between the eyes from distance that should have made accurate aim difficult even under ideal conditions. The legendary gunfighter's first bullet proving that reputation and reality sometimes aligned in ways that transformed theoretical capability into practical demonstration of skills that exceeded human limitations. The thunder of his rifle echoed through Devil's Canyon like voice of divine judgment, announcing that some crimes carried consequences that couldn't be avoided through superior numbers or strategic positioning. The chaos that followed Jacques' death revealed difference between professional killers and hired thugs who'd never faced opposition that fought back with capabilities that exceeded their own experience with frontier violence. Etienne's movement through canyon terrain was fluid and deadly, his positioning allowing him to eliminate targets while avoiding return fire that became increasingly panicked, as their numerical advantage failed to provide security that numbers usually guaranteed against ordinary opponents who lacked legendary skills. "He's just one man," Henri shouted to remaining gunmen whose discipline was cracking under pressure of facing someone whose reputation for supernatural speed and accuracy was being demonstrated through marksmanship that seemed to violate natural law. "Concentrate fire and pin him down!" But concentration required knowing where to aim, and Etienne's movement was too fast and unpredictable for coordination that depended on targeting opponent whose position changed faster than their weapons could track. Claude's attempt to use Pierre as human shield was anticipated and countered by shot placement that took the youngest Moreau brother in the head without endangering hostage, whose survival was primary objective of rescue operation that had become demonstration of why certain men earned legendary status through capabilities that exceeded ordinary human limitations. The precision required to make such shot while moving under fire represented pinnacle of gunfighting skill that few men ever achieved and fewer still maintained under combat conditions. Henry's final charge was motivated by rage rather than tactics. His wounded shoulder forgotten in desperate attempt to close distance with enemy whose rifle work was devastating, but whose pistol skills remained untested by men whose desperation had overcome intelligence that should have suggested retreat, rather than continued assault against someone whose abilities had just eliminated 13 opponents without sustaining injury that would impair his effectiveness in close combat that Henry's size and strength might have turned to his advantage if speed hadn't made size irrelevant. Henry's death came from Etienne's Colt, the legendary gunfighter's draw so fast it seemed to occur outside normal time, while his shot placement demonstrated precision that made artistic statement about difference between killing for necessity and killing for pleasure. The massive man's body hit canyon floor with finality that marked end of Moreau brothers' reign of terror and beginning of new era for Perdition Creek, where citizens could walk streets without fearing random violence from predators who'd viewed community as hunting ground rather than home. The silence that followed gunfight was broken only by Pierre's sobbing, not from fear or pain, but from relief that justice had finally come to men whose cruelty had seemed untouchable through legal means that required cooperation from authorities who'd been intimidated into inaction by threats against families and businesses that depended on community peace for survival and prosperity. "It's over," Etienne said as he cut Pierre's bonds, his voice carrying certainty that came from understanding that some problems could only be solved through superior violence applied without mercy or hesitation. "Thank you," Pierre whispered, his gratitude encompassing more than rescue from immediate danger to include restoration of faith in human decency that had been damaged by months of witnessing cruelty that went unpunished by legal systems that seemed designed to protect criminals rather than their victims. "I thought I was going to die without seeing justice for what they did to decent folks who deserved better than abandonment to predators who viewed kindness as weakness." The ride back to town was conducted in companionable silence that allowed both men to process events that had transformed their understanding of what was possible when legendary skills were applied in service of moral principles, rather than personal gain or professional obligation that served abstract concepts instead of real people whose safety depended on someone's willingness to risk everything for strangers who'd become family through shared commitment to protecting innocence from evil. News of the Moreau brothers' deaths would spread throughout territory faster than wildfire, carrying message that some places were protected by more than just local law enforcement, and that predators who chose Perdition Creek as hunting ground would face consequences that their criminal careers hadn't prepared them to survive. As they crested Final Hill before town, both men understood that their chance encounter in Devil's Den had been beginning rather than end of relationship that would give meaning to Pierre's remaining years while providing Etienne with family connection that made legendary status less isolating than it had been during decades of solitary service to justice that sometimes seemed abstract until it took human form through people who deserved protection. The celebration that greeted news of the Moreau brothers' elimination was spontaneous and heartfelt, because 3 years of systematic intimidation had created atmosphere of fear that had stifled community life while forcing honest citizens to live like prisoners in their own town, where walking streets after dark required courage that most people couldn't sustain when survival demanded avoiding attention from predators who ruled through random violence that served no purpose except their entertainment and dominance over neighbors who deserved protection rather than exploitation. Dr. Sarah Beaumont, the town's physician who'd treated countless victims of Moreau brutality while being unable to provide anything more than medical care for wounds that healed, while leaving scars on souls that might never recover from trauma that changed people's fundamental beliefs about human nature and community safety. "You've given us our town back," she told Etienne when he brought Pierre to her clinic for examination of injuries sustained during kidnapping that had been designed to demonstrate what happened to anyone who challenged criminal authority that had seemed untouchable through conventional resistance. "We can't pay you," admitted Samuel Dupuis, the shopkeeper whose business had survived through tribute payments that had consumed profits while providing minimal protection from same men who collected fees that were supposed to guarantee safety from threats they themselves represented. "But anything you need, anything at all, it's yours, for as long as you're willing to stay in Perdition Creek and help us build the kind of community where decent people can raise families without fearing random violence from men who view human suffering as entertainment." The offers of free goods and services revealed communities' understanding that their liberation had come through individual action rather than collective effort, because fear had prevented organization that might have challenged Moreau authority through coordinated resistance that would have required courage that isolated individuals couldn't sustain when threats extended to families and businesses that represented everything they'd worked to build during years of honest effort and community investment. Etienne's response to their gratitude was characteristically modest. Because legendary status had been built on serving justice rather than seeking recognition for actions that any decent man should have taken when confronted with systematic cruelty against defenseless victims who deserved protection regardless of their ability to provide compensation for services that civilization should have guaranteed through legal systems that actually functioned according to constitutional principles rather than criminal convenience. The transformation of Perdition Creek from criminal-controlled territory into legitimate community began with establishment of citizen patrol that could maintain order while federal authorities developed infrastructure necessary for permanent law enforcement that would serve constitutional principles rather than whoever could afford to purchase judicial decisions and political influence. Etienne's reputation provided initial deterrent against criminal elements who might have viewed the town as target for operations that had previously been profitable through exploitation of undefended communities. Pierre's contribution to community rebuilding revealed capabilities that age and recent hardships had obscured but not destroyed, because his knowledge of horses, cattle, and ranch management made him valuable for economic development that would provide legitimate employment for residents who'd been forced to choose between collaboration with criminals or exodus to regions where starting over was possible, but not guaranteed through individual effort alone without community support and cooperation. "We need to build something that will last beyond your presence," Pierre observed during planning sessions that brought together business owners, ranchers, and citizens whose commitment to legitimate government would determine whether their liberation from criminal control would result in sustainable improvement or temporary respite that would end when Etienne's protection was no longer available. "Good men like you shouldn't have to spend their lives cleaning up messes that communities should prevent through proper organization and mutual support." The school that they established prioritized practical education combined with civic responsibility that would prepare future generations to participate in democratic government rather than accepting criminal authority as inevitable condition of frontier life that required submission rather than resistance when predators identified communities as hunting grounds. Children who'd grown up fearing random violence would learn that civilization was possible when decent people were willing to work together for common good rather than individual survival. The economic foundation they created through legitimate businesses, honest law enforcement, and community cooperation provided model for territorial development that respected both individual rights and collective responsibility for maintaining social order that served everyone rather than just those with wealth and political connections. As weeks turned to months and Perdition Creek's reputation changed from dangerous criminal haven to thriving community, Both men understood they'd created something more valuable than personal safety. They'd built hope for future that honored memory of fallen heroes while protecting innocent people who deserved better than abandonment to predators who viewed human decency as weakness to be exploited. Marcus Beaumont's arrival in Perdition Creek represented last serious threat to community transformation that had eliminated profitable criminal operations while establishing legitimate government that served citizens rather than predators who viewed territorial authority as commodity to be purchased rather than responsibility to be honored through honest service to democratic principles. The crime boss, who'd employed Moreau brothers as local enforcers, brought 20 experienced gunmen whose skills and ruthlessness made them suitable for eliminating obstacles that threatened interstate criminal enterprise worth more than individual communities. Etienne Lafitte, Marcus announced when he found the legendary gunfighter discussing civic improvements with Pierre and other community leaders who'd learned that democracy required participation rather than passive acceptance of whatever authority claimed legitimate power through violence or political manipulation. Your interference with my business operations has cost me substantial revenue and several valuable employees whose replacement will require time and resources that I prefer not to expend unnecessarily. I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your trouble if you'll collect your people and move on to territories where your talents won't conflict with my commercial interests. The offer revealed Marcus's misunderstanding of what motivated men like Etienne. Because legendary status had been built on serving justice rather than accumulating wealth through activities that served individual interests rather than community welfare. I'm not for sale, Etienne replied, his words carrying certainty that came from 20 years of choosing principles over profit and moral obligation over personal advantage when circumstances demanded choice between comfortable compromise and dangerous commitment to protecting innocent people from criminal predation. Everyone's for sale, Marcus countered, his confidence born from years of purchasing cooperation through bribes, threats, or combination of both, that had proven effective against territorial officials whose loyalty could be acquired more easily than challenged through legal proceedings that required evidence and witnesses willing to testify against criminal organizations that controlled local law enforcement. The only question is price, and I'm prepared to be generous with men whose reputations suggest they understand practical realities of frontier business, where survival requires accommodation with established power structures. Pierre's intervention transformed negotiation into declaration of war, because the old Cowboy's refusal to accept criminal authority represented community determination that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success against superior numbers. "This is our town now," Pierre said, his voice carrying strength that had been rebuilt through weeks of useful work and renewed purpose. "We're not for sale to predators who view decent people as prey to be harvested for criminal profit. You can leave peacefully or face consequences that your money can't prevent and your gunmen can't survive." The war that erupted through Perdition Creek's streets was brief but decisive. Because community preparation under Etienne's guidance had created defensive positions and coordination that transformed ordinary citizens into effective defenders of principles they'd learned were worth dying for when the alternative was submission to criminal authority that viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than neighbors deserving protection under constitutional law that meant something only when enforced by people willing to fight for it. Etienne's tactical leadership during the battle showcased skills that went beyond individual gunfighting to include military organization that maximized civilian capabilities while minimizing casualties among defenders whose courage exceeded their training, but whose determination was strengthened by fighting for homes and families rather than just abstract concepts of justice that meant less than personal investment in community welfare. His positioning of citizen defenders created overlapping fields of fire that neutralized superior numbers through terrain advantages and coordinated response to threats that could be eliminated more effectively through cooperation than individual heroism. Marcus Beaumont's death came from Pierre's rifle. The old cowboy's shot placed with precision that proved age hadn't diminished capabilities that had been developed through 40 years of frontier life, where survival often required marksmanship that meant difference between feeding family and going hungry during harsh winters when hunting provided essential protein for communities isolated from commercial food sources. "That's for my boys," Pierre said as the crime boss fell, his words acknowledging that justice sometimes required personal action when legal systems failed to protect innocent people from predatory exploitation. The surrender of surviving gunmen marked end of criminal threat that had extended far beyond local intimidation to include interstate conspiracy involving corrupt officials and fraudulent business practices that had been generating substantial profits through systematic exploitation of frontier communities that deserved federal protection rather than abandonment to predators who viewed territorial government as hunting preserve for criminal enterprises that served individual greed rather than community welfare. As gunpowder smoke cleared from streets that had witnessed transformation from criminal control to citizen government, both men understood they'd participated in something more significant than successful defense against criminal assault. They demonstrated that ordinary people could defeat organized crime when they were willing to work together for common good rather than individual survival that required submission to authority that served predators rather than protecting innocent people who deserved better than exploitation disguised as inevitable condition of frontier life. 5 years later, Perdition Creek had become model community that attracted honest settlers, legitimate businesses, and federal investment in infrastructure that supported economic development based on constitutional principles rather than criminal exploitation of natural resources and human labor. The school they'd established had produced young people who understood that democracy required participation and that justice demanded courage from citizens willing to defend principles that were more important than personal comfort or social approval from neighbors who might prefer accommodation with evil over resistance that required sacrifice. Pierre Boudreau had become respected elder whose wisdom guided community decisions, while his horse breeding operation provided foundation for legitimate economy that served everyone rather than just wealthy interests with political connections. His transformation from broken wanderer to community leader proved that age was asset rather than liability when supported by people who valued experience and character over youth and physical strength that meant less than moral courage when circumstances demanded choice between right and wrong. Etienne's decision to hang up his guns came naturally as community peace eliminated need for legendary skills that had been developed for serving justice in territories where legal authority was whatever strongest man said it was. His marriage to Dr. Sarah Beaumont created family that gave meaning to legendary status while providing motivation for building something more lasting than reputation based on ability to kill men who deserved killing, but whose elimination was less important than creating conditions where such killing became unnecessary. The monument they erected in Town Square honored memory of all who died defending community against criminal predation, with special recognition for Jean-Baptiste and Auguste Boudreau, whose sacrifice during distant war had made possible their father's survival and eventual contribution to building peaceful society where children could grow up believing that good people would always protect innocent from evil regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success against impossible odds. On quiet evenings when Pierre and Etienne sat on the ranch porch watching sunset paint mountains in colors that memory could appreciate even when eyes could no longer see them clearly, both men understood they'd achieved something more valuable than individual survival. They'd created legacy that would protect future generations from predators who viewed human decency as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected and preserved through whatever means proved necessary when law failed and legends had to rise.